So welcome to the sixth session of the Africa Soft Power series, a summit focused on how Africa can harness its soft power to transform its trajectory. To my mind, this is one of the most important conversations of the series because it goes to the very heart of who we are as Africans. The way women are perceived in our society is an existential issue. And we all know that is one of the most important the formation and growth of a healthy society. Hence, our topic for today, pop culture, gender roles, and responsibility to audience. Earlier this week, we talked about film being one of the most powerful tools of soft power, and tomorrow we will talk about music. We already know that film can change perspectives faster than anything else. And the reason that Nollywood movies, for example, are so popular amongst Black people globally is because Black people like seeing other Black people on the screen. So are we ourselves then saying that Black women, specifically African women, are witches and Jezebels, out to get all we can? Are we to be chastised like children, beaten and even raped? Is this what we are telling our sons and our daughters that we are? Is art imitating life, or is life imitating art? These are some of the questions and issues we'll be touching on today. The session is brought to you by African Women on Board as part of its Violence in the Workplace research project, powered by Ford Foundation. A special thanks to Ford Foundation for supporting this work. We're also deeply grateful to all our strategic partners and media partners who have come on board to support this project. And finally, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our lead discussant for the day, Dr. Giti Chandra. Dr. Chandra is a senior researcher and lecturer with the Gender Equality Studies and Training Program at the University of Iceland. She's the author of Narrating Violence, Constructing Collective Identities to Witness These Wrongs Unspeakable, and co-editor of the Routledge Handbook on the Politics of Me Too movement. Giti, is an honor to have you here. And before I hand over to Giti, I want to hand over to my co-convener, AMVCA, to say a few quick words.
Thank you very much, Nkiru. I just want to first of all thank all the ladies for being here, for being with us. I think this is such an important conversation, and I think really for me, from my perspective, is just to listen and learn and support as best as one can. Thank you very much. Doc, have a good show.
Thank you, Obi. I guess we should begin. I want to begin by saying how honored I am to be in the company of such amazing women. It really is an absolute pleasure and inspirational to see all of you here. So what I'm going to do is I will introduce everybody quickly and then throw the floor open, maybe hand a few questions to keep conversation going. If anyone wants to say anything, chime in, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. You can keep your mics unmuted. I think that's fine. And we'll just see if the conversation can go without too much overlap. So to begin with, I'm going to introduce Zoe Ramushu. She's a lawyer, a film producer, and co-founder of South Africa's Sisters, working in film and TV, SWIFT, S-W-I-F-T. She's just completed a second master's in journalism from Columbia School of Journalism, is heading off to Reuters Institute at Oxford, England, to work on a project about the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and inclusivity in media. She was nominated for the Reuters Institute Fellowship at the University of Oxford, where she will give a report on the changes in the media landscape related to the Black Lives Matter movement a year after the murder of George Floyd. She's producing her first feature film in South Africa, as well as shooting 2 New York-based short documentaries. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Next, I'm going to introduce Busola Dakolo. So she's a photographer and content creator and a Nigerian women's rights activist. Busola is a firm believer in gender equality. She's lent her voice to various campaigns with many organizations, including the European Union, to help victims of domestic and sexual violence access care, counseling, and other relevant support. She was named in This Day newspaper's Game Changers of 2019 list in recognition of her social impact efforts. It's a pleasure to have you, Busola.
Thank you for having me here as well.
I'm going to introduce next Nguyen, who is head of entertainment industry at Time's Up. She oversees all entertainment strategy, talent relations, and entertainment industry programming. With a background that spans across entertainment, sports, and philanthropy, Na is a strategist who uniquely merges expertise as a publicist and experience as an independent producer to impact culture through creative storytelling. Sounds so fascinating. Now worked for over a decade in publicity at Miramax Films, Creative Artists Agency, and Paramount Pictures, in addition to TEDx, US Open, X Prize, Bad Robot, and Google. As an independent filmmaker, now produces film, television, and online content that champions women-focused narratives. Now we can't wait to hear what you have to say to us.
Incredible honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
And Mildred Okwo is one of Nigeria's most prolific filmmakers. She's a respected film director and producer whose films have been nominated and won several prestigious awards. Mildred said, don't worry about mentioning all of them, but here they go. The awards include the AMVCA, the AMAA, the NMA, and the Publix du Prix at Nollywood Paris. A former Los Angeles litigation lawyer, her film, The Meeting, was one of the top box office draws of 2012 and set a quality standard for new Nollywood films in the country. In 2016, Okwo was named one of 50 women shaping Africa by influential international women's magazine, Elle Magazine, and 100 most influential people in Nigeria by yniger.com. She's a founding member of the Nigerian Oscar Selection Committee and was recently featured in a BBC document about female film directors in Nigeria. Welcome, Mildred, and I leave it to you to talk about your latest work. And finally, as our grand finale, I want to introduce Her Excellency, Professor Abhina Pusia, who is Ambassador of Ghana to Brazil and South America, and is also professor at the Women's and Gender Studies program at Rutgers University, US. She is a writer, a poet, a feminist. Have I missed out anything? Academic, dear friend and mentor. And we're so excited to have you here. And Abby, you don't have to comment on anything, through the thing, but we depend on you to give us your thoughts towards the end.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, let's just go straight into it. I've always thought that the woman's body is a story that men tell each other. And I see all these wonderful women who are creative content creators, and I think, what happens to those stories when women tell them? How does that work? So maybe we'll just start with you, Mildred. Think about the politics of representation, your movies. How do you approach women's stories?
Well, basically, I don't think there's any difference, really. The only thing I say is you're only as good as how exposed you are. So the reason why I say this is, for example, many years ago, I lived in the States for over 20 years, and I lived there between the ages of 20 and 40. And before I went to the States, there were so many things I didn't know was sexual harassment. And that's because of the place I was coming from, which is Nigeria. There's so many things that happen in Nigeria which you think is just a normal way of doing things because the culture has made it look like it's normal. So for example, in my teens, I used to have heart palpitations just going into the open air market to buy stuff because there'll be a lot of catcalling. People, the men there will touch you as you're going. But for me, I grew up with that, and it was sort of a rite of passage. You just had to learn how to deal with it. I didn't realize that was sexual harassment. It was just a normal boys will be boys thing. So it was when I moved to the States and I had just graduated, I was 20, 21, that I started being more exposed about these things. And that's when I knew that some of these things we were taking for granted back in Nigeria were not actually right. I went ahead to study law and become a lawyer, and most of my cases had to do with sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, and that even exposed me even further. So you can imagine that now that I've become a filmmaker, all these things come to play. So I approach making films much more differently than somebody who doesn't have my experience would. So, for example, in the film, The Meeting, when I first got it from the writer, it was written by a man. It's a story that's really about a man that goes to the seat of government, which is in Abuja, to get something done, and meets and falls in love with a younger girl. Because of my exposure and my knowledge of sexual gender roles, we had to do a little bit of a would have been had I not had the background that I had. Because after reading it, I felt that the woman didn't have much to say and wasn't adding that much to the story, and we had to rewrite it. So yes, it's very important to me when I make a story how the women are represented. I want rounded characters. I want women to be able to look like they can do whatever it is they want to do, just like men can. Men have had that over the years where they can be tough, they can be aggressive, they can be quiet, whatever it is they can be, but women are usually written very one-dimensional. So I try very much so to write rounded characters for my females, because I think it impacts the society a great deal.
That's right. Thank you, Mildred. That's really, yeah, I mean, so important to be able to see representations of yourself out there instead of these stereotypes. I thought now maybe as you know, head strategist, you know, when you're thinking about what kind of programs to commission and think about, do you think about social responsibility? Do entertainment industries have a social responsibility? Shouldn't they just put out what people are willing to pay for?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what was said earlier, in that there is a great impact that storytelling has on how it shapes culture, how it changes societal norms. So I think as filmmakers and the entertainment industry, we have a great opportunity to shift that narrative, because what people see on screen is what they repeat in life sometimes, right? And with that comes a great deal of responsibility for what we are putting out there. And what we are trying to do at Time's Up is to push people who are in positions of power to be responsible in that way, to be very intentional about what they're doing and what they're saying and the products that they're creating. So I absolutely do think that there is a great deal of responsibility. And right now, more so I think than any other time, because of the unique situation that we're all in, there is a great opportunity for people to look back and really think about what has happened so far and how they can create and change what stories have been out there and see how it can improve for the better.
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, maybe you want to come in on this, Busola, you know, sort of striking off of what Nai's been saying. Do you think that entertainment or the public face of women, does it reflect adequately what women are actually going through when they fight their battles, the challenges that come to them? Does entertainment reflect real life for you?
Okay, so I would say in a way it reflects it, but there's also more to be done, because actually living it is more real than stories that are being put together. Because it's very traumatizing So I feel there are so many things around the trauma that can come into the different stories that can actually improve what's being on currently. So it's just knowing how to subtly put these things into the stories, not necessarily making it too obvious, because I sense a strong self-defense in terms of from the men once you're talking about this kind of topics. So you have to be subtle about how you introduce them into different stories. And it's the continuity, the continuous airing of such stories that would create that kind of change that we desire.
We're going to come back to all of these ideas because I have so many follow-up questions, but I just want to get everybody in. And Zoe, I was kind of wondering that as a journalist, do you find that there is a worrying gray area between a story and facts? You know how you say blah, 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 so-and-so has a story, and there's always the framing of an incident or an event or information as a story that will catch people's imaginations. And do you feel that this is a gray area? Does it worry you in any way? Does it work for you in your reporting, maybe as a journalist?
I think that in terms of journalism, one of the things that I do appreciate is the institution that I was trained at taught us to basically be cognizant of the language that we use, because it can be very problematic. Like, language is really important in defining and setting a precedent as to what people think about an incident. So if it is very tricky because there's fine lines in terms of, like, as an objective reporter, as a journalist, what you're able to say happened and didn't happen. But those kind of, that language is what has disempowered women for generations, where it is an alleged rape, it's an alleged sexual assault, it's an alleged X, Y, and Z. But I think already just being cognizant with the fact that alleging something or putting that title on something immediately disempowers and, you know, takes away the authenticity of what someone's story is problematic. And I think the fact that people are starting to think like that, and that people are starting to engage with those sort of concepts is really important at this time. I don't think we are where we need to be. And I think it's something that'll go back and forth for a while. But I do think that it's a necessary conversation that's being had.
Yeah.
And if I can just add something to what Mildred said earlier, I wrote it down so I didn't miss it, but she talked about how her experience when she was younger, about it being a rite of passage to be, you know, basically harassed, catcalled, and that sort of thing. And that was the norm. I would say that for me, it's a similar thing where it was like growing up, it was very much like, you know, you didn't know how to handle that. But I think what's really important is that in my early 20s, we were given the language. I think language is so important, the language and the terms to use to express what was happening. And even though it hasn't changed absolutely, and, you know, we're very far from where we need to be, just knowing that you can name what happened, you know, naming that sexual harassment, you sexually assaulted me, you're, you know, it's just having language. I think language is so important. It empowers people. And it's so imperative that this next generation that's coming up has that language. And I'm always impressed when I see people from my high school, they're able to articulate like what they're talking about, where before it was one of those things that just happened and you didn't even know how to express what happened. So I think language is really important, and having that ability to express what has happened to you. So.
Yeah, oh my God, it's a topic after my own heart. I'm a literature person. And one of my recent rants that I go off in, so you have to stop me if I start ranting, it's exactly this thing of language. I was reading while we were working on the Me Too book. I was reading just accounts from all over the world. And what they all seem to have in common was this idea that, you know, if you say so-and-so was a victim of, you know, a sexual attack, everyone sympathizes with that person, even though they don't know who they are. But then if you change it and you say the accuser said that, you know, so-and-so, name withheld, did this, this, and this, suddenly you make her the accuser. And as an accuser, she becomes a perpetrator. She becomes the active person rather than the victim of something. And so immediately people's sympathy is taken away from that. And that's one of the things that's been working against the Me Too movement. I was also thinking, just in terms of the women or the victims, I guess, of sexual violence, you can be a victim, you can be a survivor. There's pretty much nothing in between, and you're kind of defined by that event. Whereas the perpetrator can be, a middle-aged man, a sort of, just a socially determined man, that touchy-feely uncle, or someone who kind of meant well but sent a bad text. You know how they're seen in their whole humanity. A complete person who did one thing, and he shouldn't be defined by it. Whereas women have two terms available to them, and you have to choose between victim and survivor. Whereas the man gets to be all of these many different things. And it made me think so much about how we term our debates. What are we going to talk about? So anyway, I have all of these many things that we can, all of us, talk about, and I'm just going to keep throwing questions out there. Feel free to pitch in if you have anything that you would like to say instead. Now, I was wondering, when you aim to produce more gender equitable content, do you get pushback from a certain demographic? And by certain demographic, I mean men. Do you get, like, oh, we don't want to watch that. Come on, give us something more interesting. Or why won't you represent a woman like this? It's just so much more interesting for us. So do you lose a part of your audience when you choose to do a certain kind of content? And I can see that Mildred has something to say there too, but whoever wants to go first.
Okay.
Mildred, would you like to?
Well, I haven't had any pushback, maybe mostly because I've navigated it quite well. And what I try to do is make the story so interesting that you don't even realize what I'm seeing. And it's when you finished watching it, you realize what the agenda is. My first film was very direct. I actually had a bunch of women just killing everybody off. So I learned that doesn't work well, because actually the cinema that was around then didn't want to carry it. And I noticed that even some of the actors, in fact, I remember one actor specifically, I wouldn't name him. He said to me, do you think that Nigerian women are capable of doing this? Because he didn't think they could. It was actually a bunch of women killing all the corrupt people in the country. And he didn't think that Nigerian women had that capacity or had that capability to even think that deep. And he said that directly to me.
Wow.
And it was my first time directing. I also had a little bit of a pushback, another actor saying, this is the first time I'll be directed by a woman, which threw me off for a little, because I was coming back from the US where things were a bit more open. So I had to learn to navigate it. So what I tried to do is I write rounded characters, both for men and women. You also have to understand that men are stereotyped as well, because you have men being written as strong, virile, sexually aggressive, all kinds of stuff that in reality may not be be truthful. You understand? And then you have women written as being weak, beautiful, young. There's just this stereotypical ways that people do write these things. So I try to be very balanced, but most of all is being very interesting, that you can't say no to what it is I am writing about. But obviously there are pushbacks. There are people who have made it their life's duty to be against any movement by women to gain equality. So there's pushbacks. I just don't listen to them, and I just don't notice them.
Mm-hmm. And just to, echo what Mildred is saying, there's definitely pushback. There's a system that makes it really incredibly difficult for women filmmakers to have access to opportunities. And when they do get those opportunities, it's a domino effect, right? So even if you can make your film made, you can get it done, there are marketing dollars that needs to help promote it. There are distributors that need to put it into theaters, and there's press that needs to write about it to help it raise awareness. So there's a whole long line of things that are uphill battles for women. But I think that that's one of the things that we really do try to think about and address at Time's Up and our entertainment work, is making sure that we're holding all of the stakeholders responsible, because it's not just one area. It's getting in the door, but it's a pathway to make sure that they have the support that they need at every step of the way. Mm-hmm. So there is definitely pushback. One of the things that we've tried to do in our initiatives was something called the 4% Challenge that we launched a year and a half ago. And that was to recognize that for about 12 years, over a few hundred top grossing movies, there were only 4% female filmmakers across, I think it was 200, 300 films. And over the course of, again, 12 years, and that was just unacceptable. And so what we did was we launched this 4% Challenge to say, hey, we're going to challenge the whole entire Hollywood community to commit to working with a woman director within the next 18 months. And we pushed as much as we could with studios, production companies, individual talent who could, make these commitments and push for this. And within the first 12 months, it went from 4% to 11%, which is tremendous, but is still so much work that needs to be done. And so we're going to continue to push those efforts and make people try to commit them. And again, like I mentioned, this is a time that is completely unique in that production is at a standstill because of the coronavirus. This is an opportunity where we're going to executives and saying, this is when you should really take a look at your slate of films and what's coming up, because you have to listen to what the audience is telling you. You have to listen to what people are needing and wanting, and there are stories from women of color that have to be told, and there's no turning back. We have to continue to make the progress. So it's pushing people to employ these women directors, but in addition to that, it's making sure that they have the crew members that they need, women in leadership roles as department heads on those crews, making sure that they have the marketing and the publicity, support that they need. It's all of these efforts that have to work at the same time. So there's a system that we're trying to attack at every turn.
Yeah. I mean, that's so important, I think. And I'm glad you mentioned women of color, because we've been talking about gender as if it has no color and no intersectionality, but of course we all in this room know that it does. And I was kind of wondering whether anyone would like to go for this colorism, problem first. I know that I'm sure all of you faced it, but in India, I think it was like 10 years ago that I was finally sort of, moved enough to just write to the papers against the series of ads for a fairness cream that was called Fair. It is called Fair and Lovely, because of course, to be lovely, you must be fair. And we know that there's nobody more conscious of color than Indians. We do this to ourselves. We don't wait for anyone else to be colorist on us. Does anyone want to jump in there in terms of representation, in terms of ads or other creative content that surrounds us? How do you feel about the way this is handled?
Well, in Nollywood, for a long time, I mean, you watch the films, you can see that mostly the fair girls are the ones chosen for lead roles. But I don't know if it was intentional. I think it's just that they didn't have enough equipment to light because to light dark skin, you have to be good. Even in Hollywood, at some point, they were not so good lighting that skin. You've seen women of color in Hollywood complain that they're not provided with good makeup artists. They are not provided with good hair designers and all that. They have to really fight for these things, and you can only fight for them when you become a star. So with Nollywood, we have that phenomena where especially the male producers are going for light-skinned women. But You also have dark skin. One of our most popular actors, Genevieve Nnaji, is dark skinned, and she did quite well. We have some other dark skinned actors, but I won't lie, there is colorism, but I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because they think it's better or if they think that they can, it will be easier to light this person. It's a thing in society, and I think that Nollywood is one industry that totally mirrors the society. Whatever you see it's happening in our society, they just take it verbatim and put on films. But I've noticed that there are more women now. In the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we've had more women coming in, and you can see the changes. There are more women trying to that hire women of color, and they will spend the extra money they need for the lighting. There are more female writers now, and they're writing the way they want to write. I can name some of them from the top of my head: Rita Ora, Uduake Song, Kirun Joku, all these people from Tinsel. You can see now that there is intent because they know that the representation in film is very important. And I'm happy for these changes.
Absolutely, Mildred, I hear you. Zoe, first you, and then Nkiro, I know that you have a lot to say about this, just in terms of maybe we can talk about our joint colonial heritage. Zoe, first you.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and echo what Mildred was talking about. A lot of people talk about how, lighting is difficult and that sort of thing. That is something that is not like a mistake. It's not something that just happened. An article I was reading recently talks about how when they created cameras, the white balance was, created specifically on a white woman. And so naturally, when you're trying to balance other skin tones, it becomes extremely problematic. But that's a historical problem, which is no longer an issue because cameras are incredibly versatile. So I think that that perception is something that's just come down like, oh, it's harder to light a dark-skinned person, but it's actually not that difficult these days, especially with so many different cameras. So I think a lot of the time it's a matter of choice and a mentality that people are lazy to get over, that people are just sort of comfortable with being like, this is what I want to do. And I'm going to use like the tropes that exist to back it up. Like, oh, it's going to be difficult to light her. Makeup is so versatile these days. Like I feel like there's a lot of excuses that people make just to take the path of least resistance. They know they're going to market it, and then, it's going to be a light-skinned girl on the cover, and that's what's going to sell for them. It's harder to basically go against the status quo. And I think, to be honest, filmmakers have a responsibility to not be lazy and go the extra mile and actually make it a norm, because what people fear or aren't recognizing is that for white women, a blonde, blue-eyed white woman to become the norm, somebody had to be intentional. And so for the opposite to happen, people have to be intentional. So that's one of the things that I would point out about that. And I think it is systemic in terms of us also expressing our own internalized racism, where a lot of people, if you just chat to someone on the street, the story is, oh, light-skinned girls this, light-skinned girls that, and so it's not necessarily just in the industry and what's reflected on screen. As Mildred was pointing out, it's like reflecting what's happening on the street. So it's a change, a mindset shift completely that needs to happen. And I think one of the things that I point out is that I think all the time with a lot of my colleagues who aren't necessarily, in inverted commas, activists or working in a space that needs that. So for example, you're an accountant or, you're a doctor, so maybe you don't have to think about these things too much, because sometimes people who are in that industry think about it a lot more. But I think like with the internet, you have no excuse. It's so easy to read up and educate yourself. It's so easy to, instead of watching some random stuff on Netflix, watch a documentary that's actually educational, and you'll have one or two things to say. It's not that difficult today. These conversations are happening. And if you're not able to articulate yourself or understand what the issues are, it's because you've chosen to not understand, as opposed to it being like you're ignorant. You're being willfully ignorant. Let's put it that way, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Nkiro, would you take this from colorism to racism?
Well, I'm not supposed to be part of this conversation per se, but I'm a little bit worried about the idea that films mirror society. And I think that's one of the, for me, a really big problem, because I think we said in the film session on Tuesday that films are a way to actually change perception and change perspectives really quickly. And so if we're still getting films and, you know, in 2020 that, you know, where women are cast as witches, you know, all materialistic, everyone is light-skinned and trying to get a man, and, you know, all of those sort of things, if those are the characters we're still portraying in today's world, I think that's a really big problem. Of course, we need more women filmmakers, but I also think that we need to educate the make movies, because it's a really serious problem. It's what we're saying to our young people, that this is, you know, the images we're seeing of ourselves on the screen is who we are. I'm not personally a filmmaker, and I think that filmmakers are better off to, you know, but I feel like the ideas that we've gotten from, say, let's for example, Hollywood, about, you know, what America is, and, you know, who is beautiful and who's not beautiful, and who's strong and who's not strong, is exactly the same thing we're doing here. And Nollywood and films are an opportunity to change that conversation and tilt it around and say, you know, African women, Black women are beautiful, they're strong, they're powerful, they're not, you know, they're not a threat to men, we're not all, you know, killers of our mothers-in-laws and our husbands, and all of those things that the filmmakers are putting out on the screen. So for me, I totally 100% agree with what Zoe is saying, is like, we have a choice, and we should actually start, you know, making those choices deliberately, because if we don't, there's a major problem.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I was just thinking while listening to everyone speak, that in Bollywood, in Indian movies, for the longest time, you could tell the good girl from the bad girl from the clothes she wore. Right, the good girl was all dressed in conservative clothes, but, you know, also nice and so on. And the bad girl was always dressed in Western clothes. She had like a short skirt and a blonde wig sometimes, or she would smoke. And these were like signals, you know, little tropes that would signal to the audience, bad girl, villainess, you know, vamp, or as they used to be called. And I'm thinking about the My Dress, My Choice movement, and thinking how far we've come from that, where, of course, now in Bollywood, you look at the movies, you can't tell the good girl from the bad girl because they're all wearing the same thing. And also how this has become a thing on the streets from my, you know, younger days in New Delhi, you know, being told by people, well, you shouldn't wear sleeveless things then if you don't want to be catcalled, or, oh, they did this because you were wearing this short skirt or whatever. To now where I see women wearing whatever they want, and the ones who are getting assaulted and raped are still the ones who are in burqas, or who are in salwars, or who are in saris covered from top to toe, you know, but this is still a discussion. So I was kind of thinking, if anyone wanted to jump in, I know Zoe has something to say on, you know, just the distance we've traveled in terms of how we present women and in terms of what they wear.
Yeah, what I'd like to speak to is what Nkiru was talking about. If you don't mind, I'll just take a step back.
Go right ahead.
Who's right, or whose responsibility rather it is to change what we're seeing on screen. I do think it's individual filmmakers' decisions. Like, you have to make a conscious choice, but I also think that it needs to be the industry. It is the industry's responsibility. And I mean, the industry sounds like this massive thing, but I think people need to put pressure on the powers that be to enforce change in terms of, I mean, I'll give an example of something that I am hoping to see change in South Africa. We basically, in terms of the content that people are putting out, I don't know if people know about this intimacy coordination or intimacy directing, which is basically where you have to pay someone who's an intimacy director whenever there's a sex scene that happens. So this is someone who's external, who comes in, and basically the same way you would have someone teaching people how to do stunts, you make sure that people are comfortable when they're doing their sex scenes, et cetera, et cetera. This is an added cost, right? And that immediately speaks to, you know, where it's a woman's issue before of, oh, how are we going to do X, Y, and Z? It becomes everybody's issue because that's going to affect the budget. You know, we've got to pay. And so now you're going to see people actually questioning how many sex scenes you need. you know, like how many gratuitous, you know, there's so many sex scenes where it's like, let's just throw that in because it's like, you know, for the fun of it. But now if you've got to pay for that, people have to start actually thinking about like, do we actually need the sex scene because we've got to pay for someone to come in? It's going to cost more. But these are the kind of things where I think it's the responsibility of people who are organizing within the industry to strategically get to points where it'll force people to think about these sort of things. So it's a bit of carrot and stick. So incentive, yes, like, you know, I think it's great to be like, you know, here are these targets, here are these numbers, let's push towards X, Y, and Z. But also when it's another thing that we're doing in South Africa, which Swift worked on, is having a code of conduct in every contract in order for you to get your funding from specific entities. So you will not get your funding from X, Y, and Z entity if you haven't got a code of conduct, which you are then legally bound to implement, which means you have to train people on what sexual harassment is. You have to speak about it. It's like pushing the conversation and forcing people to think about these things. So whilst I do think it is the responsibility of individual filmmakers, and because I mean, as creatives, it is your place to basically mold the story, I also think that the industry as a whole has to also play a role and put pressure to make sure that these things are top of mind for people when they're working on things. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to add on. So I think it's both the filmmakers as individuals, but also it's a collective effort. That said, I am also from Zimbabwe, so I know, you know, there's like a lot of things where it's like that works in South Africa and maybe it doesn't work in a place like Zimbabwe where, you know, the government is not funding anything, you know, so it's like, so who are you really speaking to? And the money is coming from private individuals, so how do you organize that? But I do think in places where it's possible, where there is like systems and like funding bodies, that they have to take responsibility as well. They can't just, you know, hand out money and let people do whatever they want. They can't fund predators, basically. Yeah.
Right. And I think you're so right. I mean, social responsibility is something that I feel is also something that is catching. It's contagious. You know, I mean, people say fear is contagious, but so is courage. And when one person speaks up and when one person does the right thing, then, you know, other people feel empowered to do it too. And I wonder if I can draw you in here, Busola, and talk about the courage that it took, if you're comfortable doing it, to just talk about the courage that it took to call out somebody that, as you did yourself, and how that's going.
Okay. So for me, it's the blessing of being a mother. I've got two beautiful girls, and watching them grow, it sort of scares me. And I heard different things, you know, like close friends, things that were happening to their girls. And I knew that one day, Busola, you just have to stand up. You have to just stand up to be able to protect your own girls. And that's actually what also contributed to how I was able to speak up. It's not like I had this, you know, boldness, everything. I actually did it afraid. Like, I was so afraid, I must say that. But I knew that was the right thing I needed to do. I did not even know whether it was going to help me personally. It would help me to find healing. I didn't know anything about that. But what was just in my head is, I can help my kids and other children. We have to keep changing the social norms, because the way the family values, there's some things you can't say to your parents because you're just scared. You're asking yourself, would they believe me? They will tell you, what did you wear? Because those were the questions that I was actually asked. And I needed to answer them, even though I was so uncomfortable asking myself, like, so I caused this, you know? So that's why I know the narrative is already changing, I must say that. There's a lot that must still be done, you know, because of the patriarchal values. And it's something that has been passed from between generations. So you cannot just change it all of a sudden. It's speaking up. A lot of survivors, I would say, that have spoken to me, it's always like nobody would believe us, and I'm so scared, the stigmatization, and also how would I continue my normal life after I speak up. But I think the path of, or the journey of getting healed, it actually makes it to be more clear. It gives it, it more clarity that, oh, this was actually very, very needful, you know. So I look at myself now, and I look at myself before I spoke up. I know the difference, starting from within me, you know. So it's more psychological than physical bruises. Even if you suffer physical bruises, that's different. So there are levels to violence or sexual abuse or sexual harassment, the way people say it. So most of the time when they don't see physical bruises on you, they're like, no, 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 you weren't really harassed. Like, no, that wasn't an abuse, or especially if it comes from someone very close. It feels like, no, you must have instigated it one way or the other. And that actually makes you to keep asking yourself questions all over and over again. Because at some point for 3 years, I didn't wear anything short sleeve. I wore long sleeve, and all my skirts were passing my ankle, because I wore everything. I would dress up like a Muslim sister because I just felt I needed to protect myself. After a while, I got tired of that. I switched to the extreme, you know, so there was just a whole lot of confusion because I had questions. I couldn't provide the answers because I felt, no, this is it really, but they are telling me this. So there's a whole lot of criticism around it, but I'm so glad that conversations are going on now, and not just going on between the female gender, it's also going on between the male gender. But it's also my own, I'm wishing that the conversation will go on between generations, because I feel if it happens between generations in terms of the older ones communicating to the younger men like that, it would have more effect than it's just been within a particular generation. Because I had conversations with different people, the older, the younger, and even the ones my own age. And the conversation just seems like we're just passing it down. And most of the people that actually felt like, no, you could have told this person, no, just forgive. No, you didn't have to speak up. But speaking up has helped to save me. It's more like why I talked about the trauma, like in terms of stories. I like to create this picture. I'm a photographer, so I like to think in pictures. It's more like I left a young girl, always crying, and I would dress up as a lady that is, you know, a working class lady, everything going on together. She's a mother. But every day I'm passing by a young girl that is always crying and seeking for my attention. And that girl was actually me, or is actually me, you know. So there's a difference. I've identified with the girl now, and the girl is no longer where the girl used to be anymore. And the girl actually had potentials, you know. So I'm getting to see the potentials of that girl. So I look at every survival that there's something embedded in that little girl that you left behind. You might be in an okay place now, more like, I don't want to talk about it. No, I've buried it. No. But you find out that if you call your attention to that little girl that you left behind, I don't know how long it happened, mine almost 20 years, like 17 years, you know. But I know what has transpired between just relating with that little girl. It has helped me to have more empathy. I have more love. I'm even able to forgive better. So that's a whole lot. It's more like just connecting back to your emotions that you left behind. And that's like what makes you to be human. So I really feel it's really good to take a step, even when you don't know where it's going to lead to, as long as you just have that, you just feel that you look at the positivity and the negative. I weighed everything and I was like, okay, if anything happens to my marriage, okay, what about my kids? I was just at peace with myself, and I think that was what just helped me. And yeah, so people call it courage, but I call it like I was going to jump off the cliff and I didn't know whether I was going to die or I had wings to fly.
Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah. I feel like breaking into applause over this.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I have so many things I want to say, but I'm just going to stick with the fact that, I mean, you did it for your girls, but also for all girls everywhere.
Yes.
You know, and that's how this works. Does anyone else want to jump in on this? Because I know everyone must have a bunch of things they want to say.
I'd like to thank Busola for picking up that courage, because it's something that is so needed in Nigeria. Several years ago, when I was a kid, there was a girl that was gang raped in a university. Back then, she was slightly older than me. And I remember all the hush hush, and she had to go to court. And I remember my mother's friends talking about it. And I remember that all the boys that were involved in that gang rape, all they got was, they were rusticated from schools in Nigeria. They couldn't attend schools in Nigeria. But most of them are out. None of them went to jail. Some of them moved out of Nigeria, and they're doing well, and they didn't serve any prison time. So even though we live in a society that doesn't really punish the people who do these things to women, we still need to keep saying it. And Busola coming out was such a big lift to women's rights in this country, and we will see the effect 5-10 years from now. What I hope is that we don't all go back into the closet again, that she has taken this step for all of us, then all of us need to be able to move forward from where she has taken us. Because I want people to know that there's lots of women, Nigerian women, who support some of these patriarchal values. They support it with their whole heart, and they would still see Busola and anybody that supports Busola as the enemy. So we have to be aware of that. And those of us who are on the side of Busola, who know that it's the right thing to do, we need to fight even harder now. And I am making from this conversation, I will even be more intentional in the films I make going forward. Even though that sometimes as a filmmaker, you just want to make a film, you know what I mean? You don't want to think about these things. But as Zoe said, we must think about them, because it helps society and it helps women in society move forward.
Yeah, I think we do need to be more intentional about our social responsibility when we produce creative content. I write fiction. I write fantasy mostly for young adults, and you would imagine that in fantasy, well, it's fantasy, so you don't really have to be responsible about anything. You have dragons, what does that have to do with anything? But the more I write, the more I find that there is a responsibility. How are you representing these girls? What are the words, as Zoe pointed out, that you're going to use to describe them? And the instinct to introduce a woman character as beautiful, or something about her appearance, but to introduce a male character with something about his qualities. And I mean, we read so much of it, it's so ingrained in us that it's something that I personally find that I have to keep checking myself at every point, literally every sentence, to say, well, let's rephrase that. Do we really want to say it this way or that way? And it really is. Now you wanted to respond to Busola before I cut you off. Did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to echo that oh, sorry, Zoe. Okay, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to echo, what Zoe was saying earlier, actually, in that there is certainly a growing trend in terms of, it is not just the individual filmmaker, but it's the whole entire industry. And on the Hollywood side, she mentioned the intimacy coordinators, the code of conducts, these rules and regulations that are not just contractual obligations that people are putting forth, but we're pushing people to go above and beyond. Because as we know, contracts take years to negotiate, and sometimes it's minuscule things and gains that people are getting, which are very important still to know those rights. But we have to just keep pushing people to be able to go above and beyond what they have to do. We have to be able to push what people think is acceptable and perceived as acceptable in society right now, because we're at such a low bar. And so that is something that is certainly a growing trend with these intimacy coordinators, codes of conduct, and again, pushing people to be held accountable and take it on themselves as well to go above and beyond.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, Zoe.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, well, thank you so much, Busola, for sharing. That's incredibly empowering, like what you shared. And I know this talk is more about how, for example, the Me Too movement, and that isn't as progressive as, or hasn't had as much impact in Africa, or in African countries rather. And what I would say is that it's people like you that make it, in inverted commas, uncomfortable. But what it is that it's always been uncomfortable, but just for the victims. Like, it's always like the situation has always been uncomfortable. It's just been uncomfortable for the victims or the survivors of sexual abuse. Now it's uncomfortable for everybody. And I think that's a good discomfort, so it's like we're all dealing with it. Before, it would be like your aunt and like 2 or 3 people who know, and they're uncomfortable when that uncle or person walks in the room, or that director walks in the room. Now, when that director hopefully isn't walking into any rooms, but if he is, he's uncomfortable. And I think that's how the conversation starts and progresses, where even if maybe the legal systems are behind, maybe the people aren't getting prosecuted, it's like you do have this thing hanging over your head, not over, like hanging over the perpetrator's head, not over the, the victim or the survivor. So I think what you're doing needs to continue to happen in order for the situation to change. It happens at that level, as at the same time as people are advocating for, legal changes and policy changes. It's people like you who are driving the movement forward. So we really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I want to second, third, and fourth that. And I see from the comments that, I'm clearly, this seems to be the general feeling that one person who goes out there and puts themselves on the firing line does it on behalf of everybody else. Once 1,000 women see you, you've given 1,000 women courage to do it. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about social media movements, not just the Me Too movement, but hashtag movements that have been all over the world before Me Too came along. In South Africa, in various other countries. And this seems to me how they work, because you have a personal story, you have a personal voice. There is everyone who comes and says, I had this, and this happened to me, so that even if you don't know that person, they're anonymous. You hear the I, and that I resonates with the I, and that's really how so much of this movement, seems to work. I have 100 other topics that I really want to introduce, but Nkiru, you had your hand up.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to quickly sort of say about, it's not just on, we shouldn't talk about filmmakers and all of that. So what's the role of society in general? What is the role of courts? I mean, in Busola's case, for example, I remember when I saw the judgment and the judge said this was a frivolous case and threw it out, and something I thought was totally irresponsible. And then in the Senate, or is it in the House, we have a senator who in public beat up a woman, and he's sitting down making laws. It doesn't make any sense. So what's the role of society? What is the role of men and women? As like, how do we sleep at night knowing that this is what's going on? And, we're saying, oh, Busola is so brave to talk about it. How about us? What do we need to do more?
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that question and then throw it open. There was a high court judgment in India of a very high profile rape case where, although it was given in favor of the victim, the high court judge did find it in his heart to say that sometimes a feeble no actually means a yes.
Oh my God.
Yes.
It's like we're living in Jane Austen land, where women are coquettish. And so, when you say what is society's responsibility. It's almost as if judges stand outside society, and then we, civil society, have to walk in and say, well, you have to stop telling women how to say no. You have to teach them how to say yes. I mean, that nobody really has the guts to say yes without being slut shamed. You know, we're only ever taught how to say no. So anyway, just to throw that in, because it just, you know, I didn't know about this judgment, this detailed judgment, although I've read about your case, Busola, but that really takes the cake.
I think women in all walks of life need to just do a little bit more in your own little corner. But one of the things I've noticed over the years of coming back to Nigeria and getting even on social media, especially Twitter, I've seen a lot of change from 10 years ago. And the change is coming because there's a group of women on Twitter, a group of foundations as well that work on women issues that are constantly talking about this. Sometimes they're drowned out, but they have been talking for years. And I've seen some little changes in some of the men on Twitter. Before it wasn't there. They were so against whatever it is they thought women would say, but I'm noticing changes. So I think one of the things we just need to do is to keep on plugging on, keep on talking about it, and they will understand it as time goes on. I think the younger generation will do better than my generation did. We just sort of closed our eyes to everything. But the younger generation, I must say, are doing much better than we are. I think when Busola came out, she even had a lot more men on her side than she would have 5 years ago. And I say this is thanks to social media and the women that are working to make this happen.
So can I say something? I actually also like the aspects of the men coming into the conversation. I think it's having more impact as well. So by the time we have more men, so it's not just like it's women talking about women issues, but these men are having change in perspective, you know, they are getting to like unlearn some of the things that their fathers passed to them. So they're able to change things. So it would be good to have more men in this conversation as well, and to drive, you know, the different narratives.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we miss when we talk about language, as Zoe pointed out, is just, I mean, we keep saying this is a women's problem, whereas, you know, really it is not. It is not. It's a men's problem. If men feel that they can go out and do these things, this is a problem men have. It's like racism is a white person's problem. It's inflicted on people of color, but it is not, you know, our problem is different. How do we deal with it is our problem. Mm-hmm. Racism itself is not our problem. And so, yeah, I mean, including men in it is one way to try and do it. I constantly feel the pressure as a person in an institution that tries to teach gender equality to, you know, bring good men into the fold. And yet I don't want to bring them in at the cost of some brilliant woman whom I would have to keep out in order to bring in, you know, a young man instead. But yeah, absolutely, to bring men into the conversation and to encourage them to have their own conversations in, what are they called? They're called barbershops. Barbershop conversations where men talk to other men. Apparently. I see that Professor Pusia is here. Do you think, Abby, that you would like to just say a few words, you know, about what we've been talking about, or something else entirely? Abby, you're muted.
Sorry. I've been so happy with this conversation. I'd like to begin on a very personal note. You know, I remember at the very first African Feminist Forum that we took part in, whenever that was, we had this long conversation and made a conscious, active commitment to intergenerational conversations. And which is not as easy as you would think. And so I just want to begin as the old lady in the group by saying how really happy I am by this conversation and by being invited to listen to and take part in it. Because I'm old enough to be all of your mamas, I think. and it's just wonderful that we as Black women, as women of color, have got to the point where we can have this conversation honestly and openly amongst ourselves across generations. That is a major achievement because many of us do know and remember how hard it was for our mothers to have certain kinds of conversations with us. And part of the conversation in private was a kind of caution that we needed to be really careful where outside the bedroom that they were talking to us in, we should take all this stuff. And that's those of us who had enlightened mothers, you know? And so I just want to say clap, clap. This is really very, very exciting that you're doing it and just to continue. And Busola, I want to add my voice to all your fellow panelists and the people who are writing in, just to say, well done. I mean, I actually wrote down when you said, I actually did it afraid. Yes, because that is, of course, the price and the courage and the, you know, if it wasn't difficult, it would be done, right? And so it's getting over that bridge that says, I'm afraid, I don't know. And certainly, we all know, so many of us, at a certain point, you really did run the risk of losing your marriage. For a number of people, it doesn't matter how supportive your husband was in private. There is a cost to him for the men in the society in which you're living and walking to know that his wife is, what's the word we use in Ghana? Not violated, polluted, defiled. That's the legal term in Ghana, defiled. I mean, there is, and we know this, there is a cost to the men in our lives who are trying to support us. They then, because we're not only asking courage of ourselves, we're then asking courage of them to be able to publicly acknowledge that they don't care or whatever it is the other men are looking at. You know, that notion of defilement, it oppresses us, but it also oppresses anybody who wants to change the notion, including our spouses. And some of them have the courage to do it in private, but don't have the courage to do it in public, because then they're fighting their own fathers, their brothers, their family, the men and the women in their family, their bosses, the people who they are negotiating deals with, you know, and they, all of that. So it's not a small thing. I mean, I remember, it's been 20 years now and it's changed a lot, but I remember 20 years ago, Ghanaian women who I admire, who were out there outside of Ghana or the African continent, known in the international scene as fighting international feminists, who never used that F word at home, ever, because you're negotiating always the price. And I think that is always the issue at stake when we're trying to change the societies in which we live. And, you know, as an educator, I'm always conscious of the fact that the things that are hardest to change are the things that are invisible and the things, in a sense, that we take for granted, for good or ill. It's one of you made that wonderful comment about language and naming, about getting to name. And it's extraordinary the power of that naming something does, because we often live with things. And when we don't name them, we can't negotiate them. We can't get ourselves out of them, because the naming is really important to be able to say it exists. It's why all kinds of organizations like, I don't know, Alcoholics Anonymous, for instance. Alcoholics Anonymous make you stand up and say, I am an alcoholic, because until you say those words, nobody can help you. Until you say those words, you're a social drinker, you can handle it, you can do all those kinds of things. Until you say in public, I am an alcoholic, you can't be helped. So until we say in public, me too, or I'm not a victim, or I can wear what I want, or whatever pathway we're trying to negotiate, that is, in a sense, what gives us power. Because then other people who are facing the same issues can identify you, or can choose to identify with you. And that's the other thing that I think you brought out. All of this is hard, but it is so much easier if you do it together. Again, this is a truth we know in so many realms of life. You know, I'm a woman of faith. I'm a practicing Christian, a very unfashionable thing to say sometimes in certain situations. But Christianity, like a number of faiths, in theory, you don't need to be collective. I mean, we can read the Bible, absorb it, do what have you, and do what we need to do and live the good life and follow the golden rule, or whatever it is that, you know, we're trying to do. But the fact remains, for most of us, there is some solidarity that is empowering by that weekly or monthly or whatever it is get together. It's like whatever groups we belong to. It doesn't matter if it only happens once a year, you know it's going to happen. And that takes you through the year. Human beings, we're pack animals, really. We're collectives. And being able to identify collectivity you belong to and know that that collectivity is there enables you to fight your battles, even if sometimes you are in the room alone. It helps to know that you're not always alone, and that if you actually shout, if you need to call the troops, you know who to call, you know what to say, you know, excuse me, please, I'm going to send a quick WhatsApp, or whatever it is we need to do. And I think that that's important, because the space for activism it can sometimes be very small. And talking about the kinds of things we're talking about, we are the vanguard trying to hold the door open, trying to push the door and hold it open. And there is a price. There is a price to be paid. And so it is important to recognize the difference between singular and collective action. And it's when we move knowing that we are not alone that change really and truly happens. And, you know, we do live in a very, very technological age. And as we know, social media can have its dangers and downsides, but at the moment it is also what is giving us strength and boldness. As we all know, Me Too started a decade ago and more. And I do think we need to think about why, when it was an organization started by Black women and organized by Black women working in Black women's community, it didn't get international attention. But when it gets picked up by a certain class of star, it gets international attention. That needs to be dissected as well. But we can have no regrets if it leads to the kind of thing we are looking at. Because I have lived in the United States for about 4 decades, and I've never seen the kind of sea change shift that has taken place with Me Too, particularly post George Floyd. We're all here artists, filmmakers, storytellers, etc. So we all understand the power of symbolic moments. And I think we should be, however complex it is, we need to understand the power of that visuality and that 8 minutes. Because you see, a lot of people don't want to face things, are unconscious, that, you know, the liberals who think they've got it all together. But there was something about seeing an officer with his hands in his pockets on somebody's neck for 8 minutes that made all kinds of people who wouldn't otherwise get involved be able to have to look at themselves and say, is this really who I want to claim to be? And I think it is extraordinarily uplifting that for a vast majority of the people in the United States and outside the United States, the answer was actually no. No. Actually, if you're going to hold this mirror up to me, then no. I will do whatever it takes not to be that. Because that had happened before. But it was the combination of the time, the timing, the situation, you know, all of it. And we should be grateful for that. There's much to be dissected, but we should be grateful because there has been a sea change. I mean, you know how long the people in Bristol have been wanting those statues down, or the people in London or what have you, and within 48 hours, all over the world, these statues are coming down. Now, I'm one of those people who doesn't think history should be buried. So I don't want those statues to disappear. I need them off their pedestals. But I think they should go into, what was it a friend said, a park of disgracefuls. I mean, you know, something, they should be put up in a park or museum or somewhere else, where we can still take our school children and say, okay, now, here are these people, and this is why they are no longer standing where you used to see them. But let me tell you the story. You know, I don't think we should hide them, because that becomes another way of saying we've had our moment of glory and expiation. That's like going to a confession, but not doing anything the priest says afterwards, you know. Now, you go to the confession, you need to follow through. And I think we should also hold all educational establishments, museums, whatever, to following through on that narrative, because it has cost a lot of people too much.
Yeah,
and
I'm so sorry, Abhi. There's so much of what you're saying makes me want to think so many things and say so many things. But I was wondering if everyone noted when HBO took Gone with the Wind off.
Yeah.
And then put it back on, but they put it back on with all the framing narrative around it. So they put documentaries that talked about slavery and how the film misrepresented it. And they had a conversation, you know, between two feminists and so on. And so they put it back on. They're like, sure, watch this, but now you can see it in the framework. It's a little bit like putting, you know, the statues into a park of disgracefuls and so on. I'm kind of coming down to our last 10 minutes.
Okay, but that's important, because that also gives us permission to acknowledge the power of aesthetics and to be able to face what that does.
Yes, how are you going to hate Scarlett O'Hara with her 16-inch waist?
Pardon?
How are you going to hate Scarlett O'Hara with her 16-inch waist? I mean, really.
We don't actually know what O'Hara is, you know. Many of us don't know who she is, but that's the point you're making is exactly right. I mean, I think we do need to take a responsibility as a society and as, you know, owners and as like, you know, companies to actually do, you know, do the right thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I need to stop talking, but I just want to say I had a personal moment to do with that. And that was the book Lolita, right? I'm obsessed by Audible. I love audiobooks. Well, Lolita is read by Jeremy Irons.
Oh my God, no.
Exactly, okay? And so that made me have to really grapple with that awful novel, because, or that awful subject, or what is it? Because, you know, read by Jeremy Irons, you can hear the aesthetics, you can hear it's a well-shaped arc story, and you're sitting there feeling guilty with yourself, saying, you know, what's wrong with this picture? And how just because it's read by Jeremy Irons. But for me, it was a valuable moment because it made me have to really face that intertwining between aesthetics and ethics.
Yep, absolutely.
And when you say Lolita read by Jeremy Irons, you cannot avoid grappling with that subject.
No, of course not. Of course not. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to let Obi come in. He has a question that he wants to ask. Obi, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. I mean, I'm just, first of all, I just want to say it's an incredible panel. I mean, it's just a privilege to even be here. I just want to ask, I mean, because I've heard it said, what is the best way in which men on the continent, in Nigeria and Africa, how can we best support the women at this time in this process? Because I have a lot of South African friends as well. I hear a lot of issues from them. Obviously, we know there are issues in Nigeria, in Ghana, across the continent and in our world. What's the best way we can support?
Wow. I'm going to let everyone think. Zoe.
Maybe we just shut up. I don't know.
I was going to say, I can jump in on that. I think lending your voice to existing in organizations that are doing the work, not only lending your voice, but lending your time, lending your skills, your access, because a lot of the time when it's not just a women's movement, when it comes from specific people, it makes a difference. But even in that, one of the major things that I've learned is that males have a tendency to enter a space and dominate or co-opt it and take it with them. So just being cognizant of the fact that you are there as a support and there as an ally, and understanding what allyship is about in that sense. But I do think that there's so many spaces that men can enter that women wouldn't necessarily, like, where the conversation would be different if it was introduced by women. And I think also finding opportunity. So it's not a woman's job to find spaces where this conversation needs to happen. So if you are able to identify, oh, okay, you know, this is going on X, Y, and Z here, and I think this would be a great place, and reaching out to the people who know and are working in that space and bringing them in. So it's not just saying I'm sitting back and waiting for you guys to tell me what to do. It's like, oh, here's an opportunity, here's another opportunity. And being, I think someone mentioned earlier that, like, you know, men need to be educated. Like I keep saying, I think everyone has the opportunity to educate themselves in this age. The internet is full of information. So I think being educated enough to speak correctly when you are in those spaces, because there is those cigar lounges or whatever they're called, where men speak and are open and honest without women being there. And I think it's in those places where a lot of change also happens, where there is no female gaze, where you're getting a pat on the back for saying the right things. It's like in those spaces where no one's watching, where it's just you and the boys, those are the kind of places where women don't have access, and an educated male can make a lot of difference in those spaces. So those are just a couple of things that I would suggest as men.
You know, for example, this conversation is recorded. Do you have an all-male brotherhood space where you could say to your brothers, look, come and listen to what these women have to say and let's discuss it? Okay.
That's heavy, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of think we're at this point where we were in third wave feminism, where, you know, women of color were like, come on, do we really have to educate you about this? And I think women, you know, we want to bring men along, but I think you have to at least meet women halfway. So everything that Zoe said, absolutely. And I know that there's a lot of work being done in masculinities, because as everyone pointed out, patriarchy is as oppressive to men as it is to women. Men too have to adhere to certain, it's just that they have also the power. So there's very little in it for them to change the system, which kind of works in their favor, at least in terms of power. But it is as oppressive to men. I have a really good friend who does, you know, gender studies with me, and he's give a speech and he said, I'm just so tired of being a man. He said, it's exhausting being a man. and the students are like, what, why? You know, and yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and thank you for asking it, Obi. We're kind of down to our last 2 minutes. So should I just let the mic go around once, and if everyone can just say any one thing that they absolutely have to say?
Oh.
Now we'll begin with you.
May I just say, I just want to echo, I mean, I've learned so many things from today, and I also wanted to echo and express my gratitude to Busola and for sharing her story. And one of the things that reminded me of that I think that we could do today is, you know, again, allowing for safe spaces for people to tell their stories. But one of the things that's really important is when people are coming out and speaking their truths, we need to also believe them, because we're in a society where sometimes we're questioning them so much, and we really need to believe survivors' truths and their stories. And that's something that we could all start doing right now.
Yep, absolutely. Believe the survivor. Give women authenticity. Mildred, you were speaking when I cut you off. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that someone in someone just said in the conversation area said that men should be able to hold other men accountable when they do these things that they're not supposed to do. And it was in response to Obi's question. And I'd like to point out Busola's husband, Timi Dakolo. He held the man that did this responsible, and he went vocal and in public. He supported his wife. And I tell you, that helped things a whole lot. And I wish there were more men like him, because there's been other incidents that come up and the men seem to, and I hope that, like Obi just asked, I hope that other men can ask these questions of the women around them, and at least try to hold other men accountable for what they've done. And we also have to be aware that some of the men that will be holding other men accountable have done some of these things in the past. They've done them in the past not knowing that these things were harassment. In their own minds, they were thinking that they were just being boys. But from now on, you know, from now, with the present state of things, people should know. And like Zoe said, educate themselves. And once you've educated yourself, any chance and opportunity you have, educate somebody else. I'm glad for this panel we've had. We need to have more of them. I think it helps to put things in perspective and maybe even make more noise about it, so much more people can attend. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope to see you all again.
Thank you, Mildred. Busola, do you want to go next, and then Zoe?
Okay. Obi, I would really like to just add this, that probably when you're with the other men, it's good to let them know that apology is, apology doesn't mean that it makes you less of a leader, or I don't know how to put it, but it's very good in as much as the way Mildred said it now, that some men did it, like some of these men that they are going to like stand and have this conversation. Maybe they've done something in the past and they did not know that, oh, this was actually sexual harassment or something like that. Apology would solve a whole lot of problems if they stand up to own up whatever they did in the past, you know, just saying that this was more like a norm. We did not know. Now we know. That would help the next generation or the other men listening. You know, it will help to change the perception. So that's just my little conversation. That's yeah.
Thank you. And very, very important. I think one of the things the Me Too movement has done also is to bring reparative justice from peace and reconciliation movements into feminism, into the sexual harassment movement, to say, being able to say you're sorry makes you more of a man, not less of a man. That justice can be then include men and women, perpetrators and victims. And yeah, very important point. Zoe.
I think one of the most valuable things that I picked up from the conversation, which we weren't able to sort of unpack, was also about intergenerational conversation. I think that's really important and something that I've come across quite a bit in my time working as an activist. I think something that Abhina pointed out about how the Me Too movement was a Black female movement for the longest time, and then only when certain things happen and, you know, certain voices were lent to the movement that it became an international thing. I think that's something that I've experienced quite a bit, where, you know, there's clearly a massive history between white and Black feminism and POC feminism, and I think those discussions are really important to have with the generation coming up, because there's a lot of memory that's not passed down and a lot of mistakes that happen over and over because these conversations aren't happening. I can just give like a small, from my personal experience, where there was a lot of tensions and, you know, mistakes that were made between, you know, women working towards a movement, but that were derailed because of racial tensions. And it was a lot of, you know, this happened in the past, but women coming into the movement had no idea about this. So I think conversations like this between generations need to be had. And I think white women do need to be involved in the conversation, so that when we're all fighting towards the same things, we're aware of all the pitfalls and the ways in which, you know, the intersections need to be, the intersectionality needs to be recognized, because it is different the struggle is different for white women and Black women. And this is not to say that the movements need to be separate, but there needs to be cognizance about how they are different. So I think in terms of Kiru, whenever you're throwing another panel or putting something together, I think that's something that should definitely be discussed and would be very valuable for people going forward.
Yeah, I actually was just saying exactly that we need to have the conversation with the, you know, the women who have been there before, people in their 80s, like 60s, like 40s, because for me, the real worry is that you know, girls who are 2 years old now will go through exactly the same thing, because there's not been that, you know, handing over of knowledge and handing down of truths. And I think if the men keep sort of like, you know, burying their heads in the sand and thinking, oh, this isn't going to happen to my daughter, it is going to happen to your daughter, because we're actually learning this behavior, maybe from the screens, maybe from, you know, your homes or wherever it is. In Nigeria, for example, you're, you know, in a car driving somewhere and the policeman stops you and says, I have 2 of you at home. And that means that to him, you're actually nothing. You're just like a female, a mere female. And if we don't change those things, I don't think that things are actually going to change. Maybe for a few people at the top, things are changing, but the majority of Africans are not at the top. There's like, you know, 80% of us are poor, and things are not actually changing. And so us thinking that social media is changing things is actually not quite true, because people are still going through exactly the same thing that our grandmothers went through and our great-grandmothers went through. And so we need to actually look at that properly and have those intergenerational discussions, as Zoe said.
Yeah, I completely agree. Obi, did you want to say something?
Literally, no, I was just going to say thank you to everybody for being on the call. I thought it was an incredible session. I've learned so much, and just try to do better as a man. I think that's really what we can do. Just sort of listen, learn, and support. Busola, I think what you've done is incredible. And to all the ladies, hopefully we shall meet again post-COVID.
I hope so too. I'm going to wrap this up because we've kind of run over time, as Nkiro told us. I do want to thank everyone who's been putting their comments on the chat. We've tried to incorporate them in our discussion as much as possible. So thank you everybody for doing that and participating. I've been incredibly privileged to be part of this conversation. Really, really. I know that this sounds like a cliche, but it's entirely true. You all of you, inspirational, one and all. Thank you so much for being here and for having this conversation. And like Obi and Nkiro, I hope that we can meet again. Not some sunny day, not that ghastly song, but if we could meet again, online, offline, work together, anything to make actual change happen. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. It's really amazing to talk to all of you. And yes, we will meet again. Thank you so much.
And a special
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Here.
Thank you.
Wow.
Be well and stay healthy. It's wonderful.
Yes.
Here now.
Yes, we can. Yes, you can leave now. It's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
So, thank you all so much. Abby, thank you so much for doing this for us. Nkiro, we have to stay in touch as with everybody else.
Yes.
Of course.
Thank you so much, guys.
Bravo, everybody. Thank you. Bye.